the child who would become the emperor of the world. Please subscribe. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers before the end of this year, so we can keep making these long, sleepy journeys through history. And tonight, we're diving into one of the most fascinating rulers to ever live. Imagine this: India, the mid-1500s, a land of blazing sun, monsoon rains, deserts, jungles, and kingdoms constantly at war. Into this world was born a child, small, fragile, and unaware that he would one day rule one of the richest empires the world had ever seen. His name was Jalal-ud-din Muhammad Akbar, but history remembers him simply as Akbar the Great. The man who would bring together Hindus and Muslims, Rajputs and Persians, poets and soldiers, dreamers and kings. But the world he was born into was anything but peaceful. His father, Humayun, had been chased from his throne by the Afghan warrior Sher Shah Suri. The Mughal dynasty, descendants of Timur and Genghis Khan, was broken, scattered, and almost destroyed. When Akbar was born in 1542, his father was a fugitive, living in exile in the deserts of Sind. There was no palace, no throne, no army, only survival. His mother, Hamida Banu Begum, gave birth to him in a small tent. It's said that even then, a priest predicted greatness for the boy. But greatness often begins in dust. As a child, Akbar didn't grow up in comfort. He learned to ride before he could write. He learned to fight before he could read. In fact, he remained illiterate all his life. But his mind was sharper than any scholar's. He listened, he observed, he remembered. By the time he was 13, his father had reclaimed Delhi, only to die shortly after in a tragic accident, falling down a staircase. And suddenly, the boy who had been born in exile was thrust into power. A teenager, barely old enough to hold a sword, now sat on the throne of the Mughal Empire. But there was a problem. Real power didn't rest with him. It rested with his regent and protector, Bayram Khan, a brilliant general and strategist who had served Akbar's father. For the first few years, Bayram Khan ruled in Akbar's name. The empire was still fragile, surrounded by enemies, Afghans in the north, Rajput kingdoms in the west, and rival Mughals waiting to take advantage of a young king. But something was different about Akbar. Unlike most child rulers, he didn't fade into the background. He learned, he watched, and slowly he began to take control. There's a story that shows the kind of courage Akbar had, even as a teenager. During a hunt, a raging elephant charged at him. Most men would flee. Akbar didn't. He spurred his horse forward, faced the beast head-on, and struck it between the eyes. The elephant stopped. His men couldn't believe what they had seen. It wasn't just bravery, it was symbolism. Akbar had looked chaos in the eye and refused to back down. Over the next few years, he would prove that this wasn't a one-time display of courage. He would lead armies into battle, expand his territories, and carve out the beginnings of a new kind of empire, not one ruled by fear or religion, but by something far more enduring, understanding. But that transformation wouldn't happen overnight. It would take wars, betrayals, and heartbreaks. And it would begin with his first true test as a ruler, breaking free from the shadow of his guardian, Bayram Khan. Because sometimes before you can rule an empire, you have to overthrow your own protector. When you're born into chaos, power doesn't come from birthright. It comes from timing and courage. For years, young Akbar was more symbol than sovereign. Bayram Khan, his regent, was the one truly ruling the Mughal Empire, and to his credit, he did it well. He defeated enemies, secured the frontiers, and even reconquered Delhi. But power, like fire, can't be held in someone else's hands for long without burning everything around it. Akbar was growing up fast, and the empire around him was whispering, "Is he truly a king or just a name on the coins?" By the time Akbar turned 18, he had seen enough to know one truth. To rule, you must own your throne. So one day in 1560, he made a decision that would change his life and the course of the Mughal Empire forever. He called Bayram Khan to court. Calmly, respectfully, he relieved him of all authority. He offered him riches, land, and honor, but stripped him of power. It was not a betrayal, it was a graduation. The student was ready to rule. Bayram Khan, however, didn't take it well. The man who had raised Akbar like a son felt abandoned. He rebelled, marching an army against the boy he once protected. But destiny had already chosen sides. Akbar's forces defeated him near Jalandhar. In a final act of mercy, Akbar spared his life and sent him to Mecca to live in peace. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of an empire. With the old guard gone, Akbar began to rule with his own mind, his own will, and what a mind it was. He was barely out of his teens, but he already thought like a philosopher king. He was fascinated by the world, by people, by their beliefs, by their customs. Unlike most rulers of his time, he didn't seek to crush difference. He wanted to understand it. But first he needed stability. The empire was surrounded by enemies, Afghan warlords in the east, Rajput kings in the west, and a population still recovering from years of conflict. The treasury was weak. The administration was fractured. Akbar knew he couldn't fix this by the sword alone. Still, sometimes the sword is the first step toward peace. He began his campaigns with a clear goal: to unite northern India under one banner. His first major conquest came at Malwa, a strategic region ruled by a defiant Afghan leader. The battle was fierce, and Akbar personally led his troops into combat. When victory came, it sent a message across the subcontinent. The boy emperor was now a warrior king. But war alone wouldn't make him great. It was what he did after victory that made him unforgettable. Unlike other conquerors, Akbar didn't massacre his enemies. He forgave them. He offered them positions in his administration. He turned former foes into allies. He knew that the key to ruling a vast, diverse land wasn't fear, it was inclusion. This philosophy reached its true test in his dealings with the Rajputs, the proud warrior clans of Rajasthan. For centuries, they had resisted Muslim rulers with iron determination, but Akbar approached them not with arrogance, but with respect. Instead of demanding submission, he offered friendship. He married a Rajput princess, Harkabai, later known as Jodhabai, not just as a political alliance, but as a symbol of unity. It was a revolutionary act for its time. Through diplomacy and marriage, Akbar won over most of the Rajput kingdoms. He didn't force conversions, he didn't destroy temples. He allowed them to serve in his army and his court as equals. This was something India had never seen before. A Muslim emperor who ruled over a largely Hindu population, not through terror, but through trust. By the mid-1560s, Akbar's empire stretched from the Hindu Kush Mountains to the Bay of Bengal. The Mughal capital at Agra buzzed with life. Markets overflowed with silk, spices, and gemstones. Scholars, poets, and artists came from Persia, Central Asia, and India to seek his patronage. He built forts that looked like red mountains: Agra Fort, Fatehpur Sikri, massive, symmetrical, and eternal. These weren't just fortresses, they were statements. The Mughals had arrived, not as invaders, but as builders of civilization. But beneath the golden glory, something else was brewing inside Akbar. A hunger not just for conquest, but for knowledge. He began spending long nights with philosophers, priests, mystics, and scholars of every religion. Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, Christians, Jains, Zoroastrians, all were invited to his court to debate faith, reason, and morality. And somewhere in those endless discussions, Akbar began to question the very foundations of what it meant to rule. What if truth didn't belong to one religion? What if an emperor's duty wasn't to enforce belief, but to understand it? These questions would shape the next stage of his life, and eventually transform the Mughal Empire from a kingdom of conquest into an empire of ideas. But before enlightenment there would be blood, because the deeper Akbar's empire expanded, the more dangerous his enemies became. And one day, a single rebellion would threaten to burn down everything he had built. Every empire has a moment where the crown trembles, where all the victories, all the alliances, all the glory seem one step away from collapse. For Akbar, that moment came not from the outside, but from within. The early years of his rule were defined by conquest and diplomacy. But by the 1560s, the Mughal Empire had grown too quickly, too vast. And in the shadows of his success, local rebellions began to spark. Some were driven by ambition, others by faith, but all had one thing in common: they underestimated the young emperor. One of the first serious threats came from his own relatives, the Mirzas, Persian nobles who had once been loyal allies of his father, Humayun. They had ruled small territories in Gujarat and Malwa, and when Akbar tried to bring them under central control, they rose in defiance. It was rebellion cloaked in arrogance. Akbar didn't hesitate. He rode at the head of his army, leading his troops personally through the harsh deserts of western India. His enemies thought he would send generals, but Akbar wasn't a ruler who hid behind his throne. He was a horseman, a warrior, a strategist who could sense the rhythm of battle like a heartbeat. When the Mirzas realized the emperor himself was coming for them, their courage shattered. The rebellion was crushed, swiftly, decisively, and publicly. Akbar didn't destroy them out of vengeance. He destroyed them to send a message. The empire is not divided. There is only one sun in the sky. But even as he stamped out internal threats, new challenges emerged. The powerful sultanates of Gujarat and Bengal, rich independent regions, refused to bow to Mughal authority. Gujarat was a jewel on the Arabian Sea, a land of spices, diamonds, and merchants trading with the world. To control it meant controlling India's gateway to the west. In 1572, Akbar marched west with his forces. He crossed scorching plains, crossed rivers swollen by monsoon rains, and finally reached Ahmedabad, the capital of Gujarat. The Sultan's army was vast, but disorganized. The Mughal artillery thundered like a storm, and in a matter of weeks Gujarat fell. It was one of Akbar's greatest victories, but the victory almost cost him his empire, because while he was celebrating in the west, rebellion erupted in the east. A group of Afghan chiefs and Mughal officers rose up in Bihar and Bengal, led by a man named Muzaffar Khan, hoping to seize power while the emperor was away. For a moment, it worked. His armies retook forts, seized treasuries, and threatened to cut off Mughal supply lines. But then Akbar did something that became legend. He didn't send reinforcements. He didn't retreat. He simply mounted his horse, and in an act of sheer willpower, rode nearly 700 miles from Gujarat to Agra, across mountains, rivers, and heat in 9 days. 9 days, on horseback, through the monsoon. It was more than a march. It was a statement that the Emperor of India did not sleep while his empire burned. When he reached Agra, his clothes were torn, his eyes red, but his mind razor-sharp. He reorganized the army, led the counterattack, and crushed the rebellion before it could spread. That ride became a story whispered across India, a myth made real. People began to see Akbar not just as a ruler, but as something larger, a force, a man who could move the earth if he willed it. After this, peace returned, and with peace came the chance to build. It was now that Akbar began shaping the empire not just with soldiers, but with ideas. He created a centralized administration unlike anything India had ever seen. Taxes were standardized, roads were repaired, the postal system was expanded. He abolished taxes on non-Muslims, a radical move that shocked orthodox advisors, but won him the loyalty of millions. He also introduced one of the fairest land revenue systems in history, designed by his finance minister, Raja Todar Mal. Instead of arbitrary tribute or extortion, land was measured, productivity was assessed, and taxes were based on actual yield. Farmers, for the first time, could plan their lives without constant fear of ruin. This was governance that worked, not by greed but by logic. Meanwhile, his court became a magnet for brilliance. 9 extraordinary men, known as the Navaratnas or 9 Jewel, defined his golden age. There was Birbal, the witty courtier and poet whose humor could make the emperor laugh even in moments of despair. Tansen, the musician whose voice was said to light lamps and bring rain. Abul Fazl, the scholar and historian who chronicled Akbar's reign with elegance and honesty. Todar Mal, the financial genius who revolutionized Mughal economics. And many more, poets, philosophers, generals, who turned the Mughal court into the intellectual heartbeat of Asia. But even as Akbar surrounded himself with brilliance, something was changing inside him. He was beginning to drift from traditional religion. The more he learned, the more he questioned. He prayed, but not in one direction. He believed in fate, but not in fate alone. He began to see truth as a light refracted through many colors, not a single flame. It was during this time that he founded the Ibadat Khana, the house of worship, in his new city of Fatehpur Sikri. Every Thursday night, scholars and theologians from all faiths would gather to debate in his presence. The discussions were intense, sometimes chaotic, as ideas clashed and philosophies collided. But in the silence that followed each argument, Akbar found something deeper, a belief in humanity above creed. He began forming a philosophy he called Sul-e-Kul, meaning peace with all. It wasn't just a slogan, it was the foundation of a multicultural empire that saw its citizens not as subjects of faith, but as people of one realm. Under this vision, the Mughal Empire flourished like never before. Trade boomed, art thrived, and architecture reached divine heights. The empire was now not just a political force, it was a civilization. And yet behind the grandeur, behind the wisdom, there remained a human heart, a heart that could be fierce, a heart that could love. And one day, that same heart would break, when power and emotion collided in a way that would haunt the emperor forever. Because even the greatest ruler of men cannot always rule himself. The year was 1561. Akbar was still young, barely out of his teens, but the world around him was already testing his legend. The empire he inherited was vast in name, but fragile in truth. The Mughals had been driven out of India once before, and the scars of that humiliation still haunted his court. Afghan warlords prowled the north, Rajput kingdoms refused to bow, and whispers in the bazaars of Delhi said the boy emperor was nothing more than a puppet of his regent, Bairam Khan. But Akbar was no puppet. He was patient, calculating, watching, and waiting for the right moment to show the world what kind of ruler he really was. It came sooner than anyone expected. Bairam Khan, the man who had guided Akbar's rise to the throne, began to overstep. He made enemies in court, dismissed nobles loyal to Akbar's bloodline, and even began issuing orders as if he were emperor himself. The whispers reached Akbar's ears, and for the first time he made a move that would define his rule. In 1560, Akbar quietly dismissed Bairam Khan. The regent didn't take it well. He rebelled. For a brief moment, India watched as student and teacher faced one another on the battlefield, one fighting for the future, the other clinging to the past. When the dust settled, Bairam Khan was defeated. But Akbar didn't execute him. He pardoned him, a decision that shocked everyone. This was Akbar's first true message to the empire. He was not a tyrant. He was a ruler of justice, of reason, of vision. But mercy has limits. Not long after, Bairam Khan was assassinated by an Afghan rival while on pilgrimage to Mecca. Akbar mourned him deeply, but from that day he ruled alone. And that's when his empire truly began to rise. The Mughal court in Fatehpur Sikri would later call this Akbar's awakening. It was the point where the boy emperor vanished and the Badshah emerged. He began reforming everything, from the tax system to the army. Gone were the chaotic medieval ways of his ancestors. Akbar built an empire not of tribes or bloodlines, but of ideas. He recruited not just Persians and Mughals, but Hindus, Rajputs, and Afghans. He believed a kingdom divided by religion could never last, and he was right. The most remarkable proof of this came through his alliances. Rather than conquering the Rajputs through endless wars, Akbar did something few rulers in history would dare to do. He married into their families. He forged bonds not with bloodshed but with trust. His marriage to Princess Hira Kunwari of Amber, later known as Mariam-uz-Zamani, became legendary. It wasn't just a union of man and woman, it was a symbol. A Muslim emperor and a Hindu princess. Their son, Prince Salim, would one day become Emperor Jahangir. But this alliance did something far more important than produce heirs. It built bridges. Rajput kings who once defied the Mughals now rode beside them. The swords that once faced Akbar were now raised in his name. And so, brick by brick, India began to unify under his rule, not by fear but by shared destiny. Still, not all accepted this vision. Some conservative scholars at Akbar's court began whispering that the emperor was straying too far from the faith. His openness toward Hindus, his tolerance of different customs, even his fascination with philosophy and mysticism, all of it began to alarm the orthodox elite. But Akbar didn't silence them. Instead, he did something completely unexpected. He built a house, the Ibadat Khana, the house of worship. Every Thursday night, scholars from across the empire gathered there. Muslims, Hindus, Jains, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians. And Akbar would sit among them, listening, questioning, debating. Imagine it, In a time when religious wars were ripping Europe apart, a Muslim emperor in India sat cross-legged among priests and philosophers, asking questions about truth, existence, and the divine. He wasn't mocking religion. He was trying to understand it all, to find a way to unite the human spirit beyond dogma. And from those nights of fire and discussion, Akbar's philosophy began to take shape. He called it Sulh-i-Kul, peace to all. It became the soul of his empire. But peace has a price. Outside the marble halls of Agra, rebellions still burned. The Afghans of the northwest were stirring again, led by the fierce ruler Daud Khan. Meanwhile, Gujarat, a rich coastal province, had fallen into chaos. Akbar, restless and relentless, took the field himself. He rode with his soldiers, ate their food, fought in the mud beside them. He wasn't a distant ruler sending orders from a palace. He was in the dust and blood of the battlefield. One Mughal chronicler described him like this. He rode into war not as a king, but as a storm. In campaign after campaign, Akbar crushed rebellions, reclaimed territories, and expanded the empire to its largest borders yet. But even in conquest, he was strange, as different. After victory, he didn't slaughter his enemies, he absorbed them. He offered them posts, honors, and dignity, turning foes into loyalists. By 1573, Gujarat had fallen. Bengal soon followed. The Mughal Empire now stretched from Kabul to the Bay of Bengal, a realm so vast that travelers said the sun never set on Akbar's dominion. But at the height of his triumph, Akbar did something few rulers would ever dare. He began questioning everything, even himself. What is power without wisdom? What is faith without understanding? What is empire without justice? And those questions would lead him into his most controversial and dangerous era yet. Because as Akbar's mind grew, so did the distance between him and his advisors. The very men who once praised his vision began to whisper again, this time not about his youth but about his heresy. They said the emperor no longer followed the ways of Islam. They said he was trying to create his own religion. And in a way, they weren't entirely wrong. By the late 1570s, Akbar had become something more than just a conqueror. He was a philosopher on a throne, and the empire he ruled wasn't just held together by swords or taxes, it was held together by curiosity. But curiosity is dangerous, especially when it challenges the beliefs that hold entire civilizations together. Inside the walls of Fatehpur Sikri, Akbar's new capital, strange things began to happen. There were no endless wars, no royal hunts, no lazy indulgence like the courts of other kings. Instead, there were debates. Hours-long discussions about the soul, about the afterlife, about what makes humans good or evil. The emperor would sit in silence while theologians argued, sometimes for days over one line of scripture. Jesuit missionaries from Portugal came bearing Bibles and crucifixes. Hindu sages arrived with sacred fire and verses from the Vedas. Muslim scholars quoted the Quran. Jain monks spoke of non-violence, and Zoroastrians talked about light and shadow. And Akbar? He didn't reject any of it. He listened to all of them. That made him powerful. But it also made him dangerous. In one famous moment, a Jesuit priest asked Akbar directly, "Do you believe in the Trinity?" The emperor smiled. "I believe," he said, "that truth is too great to fit in one cage." That sentence alone spread like wildfire. Some called it wisdom. Others called it blasphemy. The conservative scholars at court, the ulama, began to fear him. They whispered that Akbar's heart had turned away from God. And yet no one dared challenge him openly. Because Akbar wasn't just a scholar. he was still the general who led men through deserts and battlefields. He could discuss theology one night and command an army the next morning. That combination made him untouchable. Then, around 1582, something extraordinary happened. Akbar announced a new order, a spiritual idea that would shake the empire to its core. He called it Dini Ilahi, the faith of the divine. It wasn't a new religion in the way the priests feared. It had no scripture, no prophets, no temples. It was more like a code of honor, a philosophy of life. He wanted to take the best teachings from every faith, mercy from Islam, love from Christianity, purity from Hinduism, discipline from Jainism, and light from Zoroastrianism. To Akbar, all religions were rivers flowing into the same ocean, and he wanted his empire to live by that truth. But to the orthodox minds, this was heresy. They accused him of trying to become a god himself, of replacing religion with his own ego. And in some ways, that fear wasn't entirely unfounded. Because as Akbar's legend grew, so did the cult of his personality. Courtiers began bowing to him with hands folded, almost as if in prayer. His name was inscribed in coins as Jalal-ud-din Muhammad Akbar, shadow of God on earth. Some said the emperor had gone too far. Others said he had simply outgrown the limits of tradition. Meanwhile, beyond the philosophical storms of Fatehpur Sikri, the empire continued to expand. Akbar sent his generals to secure Kashmir, Sindh, and the rugged mountains of Baluchistan. He dispatched armies to Orissa and Bengal, to the edges of the Indian Ocean. The Mughal flag now flew over lands that even the great conqueror Timur had never dreamed of ruling. Trade flowed through his empire like blood through veins. Silks from Persia, spices from the south, gold and diamonds from the Deccan. The Mughal treasury glittered, but Fatehpur Sikri itself, his masterpiece city, was slowly dying of thirst. The lakes and wells dried up. The courtiers whispered that the gods themselves had abandoned it. By 1585, Akbar moved his capital back to Lahore. The city of red sandstone and white marble became a ghost. Empty streets, silent courtyards, faded glory. It was as if the empire's heart had shifted west, closer to the frontier where new enemies waited. Because now another storm was rising. To the north, beyond the Khyber Pass, the Uzbeks were growing restless. They had once been Akbar's kin, descendants of the same Turco-Mongol bloodline that produced Timur and Genghis Khan. But kinship means little in politics. The Uzbeks wanted to reclaim Kabul and the mountain passes that guarded India's northern gates. Akbar rode out again. Even in his 40s, his stamina was legendary. He would wake before dawn, pray, hold court, then ride for hours inspecting his troops personally. The Uzbeks expected a scholar king. What they got was a seasoned warrior. By the end of the campaign, the frontier was secure. But Akbar had seen enough blood for one lifetime. He returned to Agra quieter, more reflective. Something inside him had changed. In those later years, Akbar's obsession with truth deepened. He began to retreat from public life more often, leaving day-to-day matters to trusted ministers. He spent nights in meditation, stargazing, or listening to music. He spoke often of the futility of power, how empires rise and crumble, but ideas live on. He ordered translations of the great Sanskrit epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, into Persian. He wanted his Muslim courtiers to understand Hindu wisdom, and vice versa. He told his scholars, "The pursuit of knowledge is the greatest act of worship." He even reformed how justice was delivered. He created a more centralized court system, forbade child marriage among Hindus, and gave women property rights. For a man raised in a world of conquest, Akbar's reforms were almost utopian. But no empire, no matter how enlightened, escapes betrayal. And for Akbar, betrayal would come not from an enemy, but from within his own family. Prince Salim, his eldest son, born of Mariam-uz-Zamani, the Rajput queen, had grown restless in his father's shadow. He had inherited Akbar's fire, but none of his patience. While Akbar spent his nights studying philosophy, Salim spent his gambling, drinking, and surrounding himself with poets and courtiers who flattered his ego. The tension between father and son simmered for years until finally it erupted. Salim rebelled. He declared himself emperor while his father still lived. For Akbar, this was more than betrayal. It was heartbreak. The man who had built an empire on tolerance, reason, and justice now faced rebellion from his own blood. He didn't execute Salim. He couldn't. Instead, he tried to reconcile. He sent messages, offers of peace, gestures of forgiveness, and slowly the storm began to calm. But those close to Akbar said he was never the same again. The fire that had once driven him, the unstoppable curiosity, the boundless energy, began to fade. His hair turned white. His nights grew longer. He became quieter, his laughter rarer. He spoke often of death, not as an end, but as another mystery waiting to be explored. And in 1605, at the age of 63, Jalal-ud-din Muhammad Akbar, the emperor who had united India, tamed an empire, and tried to unite humanity, finally closed his eyes. His son Salim would ascend the throne as Emperor Jahangir. But the world would never again see a ruler quite like Akbar. They buried him in a marble tomb in Sikandra, near Agra, a resting place surrounded by gardens and walls carved with verses from the Quran. Not verses about conquest or punishment or fire, but verses about mercy, patience, and peace. It was fitting, because Akbar's empire had been built not only by the sword, but by the mind, and by a heart that refused to see the world in black and white. Yet as the centuries passed, the memory of that heart began to fade. His successors, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb, all inherited his empire, his army, his palaces, but few inherited his vision. Jahangir loved art and wine more than philosophy. Shah Jahan built the Taj Mahal, yes, but he ruled a world already cracking beneath its own beauty. And Aurangzeb, the Puritan, would undo much of what Akbar had stood for. By the time the Mughals reached their twilight, the empire Akbar built through tolerance had been drowned in dogma, politics, and greed. The dreamer was gone. The machine remained. Still, Akbar's spirit refused to disappear. In India's dusty villages and crowded cities, his name survived in stories whispered by old storytellers under banyan trees. The peasants remembered him as Akbar the Just, the ruler who abolished the jizya tax on non-Muslims, who protected the weak, who could walk through his markets without fear. The artists remembered him as the emperor, who gave them work and freedom to create, and the scholars remembered him as the man who turned a kingdom into a school of thought. His coins may have tarnished, his palaces crumbled, but his ideas, those impossible, dangerous, beautiful ideas, still glimmered through the centuries. Akbar understood something most rulers never do. That power without understanding is brittle. That unity forced by fear will always shatter. And that real greatness isn't about how many lands you conquer. It's about how deeply you make people think. He once said, "Reason is the lamp of God. Those who extinguish it burn themselves in darkness." That line, pulled from a forgotten manuscript in the Mughal archives, feels prophetic now. Because the world Akbar imagined, a world beyond religion, beyond tribe, beyond the old lines that divide, is still the world we're struggling to build. In that way, Akbar wasn't just a Mughal. He was a warning, a mirror, and a possibility. Centuries after his death, when the British came to India, even they spoke his name with a strange respect. They studied his administration, his land reforms, his bureaucracy, and quietly borrowed them. Many of the structures Akbar designed became the blueprint for modern India's governance centuries later. But history is funny like that. It rarely remembers the builders. It remembers the destroyers. So when people speak of the Mughals now, they talk of battles and invasions, of blood and walls. Few talk about a man sitting in a silent hall, listening to philosophers argue by candlelight, trying to understand what connects one soul to another. That was Akbar's true empire, not his fortresses, not his armies, but his curiosity. Even his tomb tells a story. In the stillness of Sikandra, if you walk through the main gate at dusk, the air hums with crickets and the wind moves softly through the marble arches. The walls are red sandstone, faded but warm, glowing like dying embers. And in the center lies Akbar's grave, simple, unadorned. A white marble slab under open sky. No golden dome, no jeweled canopy, just silence. Because maybe that's how Akbar wanted it. After a life spent questioning everything, he finally found the one truth he couldn't argue with, that even kings become dust. But dust can still carry stories. And his did. When the British archaeologists first opened his tomb centuries later, they were struck by how modest it was compared to his power. No treasures, no weapons, just verses and a name. Jalal-ud-din Muhammad Akbar, the greatest. He wasn't perfect. He could be ruthless. He executed rebels without mercy. He built an empire on war before turning to peace. He silenced those who opposed his vision, and yet even his flaws made him human, not the flawless saint history sometimes pretends he was. He was a paradox, a conqueror who preached tolerance, a Muslim who bowed before Hindu idols to learn their meaning, a king who treated peasants as if they mattered, a man who ruled millions, but spent his life searching for truth. That's what makes Akbar eternal. Every generation, someone rediscovers him and asks the same question. How did one man in the 1500s think more freely than entire empires do today? And maybe that's why people still make videos, still write books, still tell stories about him. Because Akbar's life isn't just history, it's a mirror for us. We talk about progress, we talk about tolerance, but he lived it centuries ago, surrounded by deserts and daggers. Imagine this. A 26-year-old emperor sitting under a lantern at midnight, surrounded by scholars from every religion, discussing the meaning of truth. No cameras, no audience, no ego. Just a man who wanted to understand the world he ruled. That's what makes Akbar different from the others. He didn't just build an empire of land, he built an empire of ideas. And long after his monuments crumble, that empire will keep expanding. Through stories like this one, through voices like yours, through nights like tonight. So if you're still awake, maybe that's the point. Because history isn't supposed to just lull you to sleep. It's supposed to make you dream about the kind of world that men like Akbar once dared to imagine. So, before you drift off, if you enjoyed this story of one of history's most misunderstood emperors, please subscribe to Disturbed Historian. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers before our holidays end. so we can keep bringing these forgotten worlds back to life, one sleepless night at a time. Good night. And remember, even the greatest kings fade into silence. But their ideas, they whisper forever.